Hello everyone. Welcome to the launch reading for our issue, Contested Histories, issue 11 of ADI magazine. I'm really excited to be joined here tonight by contributors Anna Badkhen and Annia Ciezadlo. ADI magazine is a publication run by a group of women of color, and ADI is a Tamil word that means to strike, with three connotations, which includes protest, violence, and intervention. And we are really dedicated to sort of creating a platform for voices from the global majority, and particularly pushing against a kind of like American-centric literary landscape, and really kind of looking at the intersections of the political, the personal, the aesthetic, the literary, and kind of rooting that in the lived experiences of people around the world. I'm very excited and happy to enter ADI as editor-in-chief earlier this fall. And we're very excited to present to you the full issue 11, our full 11th issue. We had so much that we had to break it up. Like in terms of publication, we published the first batch a couple of months ago, and then the final pieces were finally published earlier today. I really recommend that you check it out. It's on adimagazine.com, adimagazine.com. Come check it out. I really, you know what I say to my friends when I talk about ADI is, like read it, share it, teach it. There is so much that is teachable from the collection of works that we have, and especially particularly this issue, because we are looking at all of our contributors on some level are looking at accepted narratives of what has taken place, and kind of looking at the undercurrents that are in tension with those dominant narratives. So it's a really powerful tool for organizing, for reimagining, for just kind of inculcating a new consciousness, hopefully, where we all kind of get to know our world a little bit better, a little bit more accurately, a little bit more precisely, a little bit more compassionately. So with that, I'm very excited to kind of move into this. We were going to have a third contributor share her poetry tonight, Athena Farrokhzad. Unfortunately, something came up for her and she is not able to join us. But I do have permission from her to read her poems that are in the issue. So we're going to start with that. But before we do that, I want to introduce our three contributors. I'll start with Athena, then Annia, who's going to go second, and then with Anna. And then afterwards, we're going to just transition to a conversation that I personally am very excited about. So Athena Farrokhzad was born in 1983 and lives in Stockholm. She is a poet, literary critic, translator, playwright, and teacher of creative writing. Her book, White Blight, which I have taught before, is out in the US in Jennifer Hayashida's translation. Annia Ciezadlo is an author and journalist who writes about food and power in crises and catastrophes, from wars and revolutions to coronavirus and climate change. She is the author of Day of Honey, a memoir of food, love, and war. And finally, Anna Badkhen was born in the Soviet Union and is a US citizen. She's the author of Bright, Unbearable Reality and 6 other books of nonfiction. Her awards include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Barry Lopez Visiting Writer and Ethics and Community Fellowship, and the Joel R. Selden Award from Psychologists for Social Responsibility for writing about civilians in war zones. So I am going to begin with a reading of Athena's poems. We are getting for like our American readers and fans of Athena, we are getting an early excerpt here from her new work, Donkey Days, which was just published in Sweden and is in the process of being translated right now by Jennifer Hayashida for the United States readership. What a fate, my aunt whispers on the phone. her voice broken by 4 unprecedented decades. Twice, we have sent her embalmed children on planes across the continent. How much? I asked the funeral director, as if we had hired him for any shipment. He replies, it depends on the weight of the deceased. Kale, how do you manage to turn night into day? This glacier will destroy me, and they did not even rest in my womb. Every dawn I weep in the armpit of my beloved. Tell me again, the fable of how the impossible simply takes a bit longer. One day, my aunt vows, the flames will find even those for whom a life is worth less than donkey dung. Until then, we will leap over the fires and shout that the red is ours, that the fire can keep the yellow. We will gallop through the streets, cry like crows from the rooftops, that God is great, and greater than God is the wrath when we gather. And to those who lick their wounds in cover of darkness, we will say that no salve can cure a rot that has entered the blood. There are people you have never met who love you. I say to my daughter, she understands. Like Papa loves his team and like I love a mermaid, I forbid my beloved to answer when the phone rings. If someone is dead, I don't want to know. My aunt's cries to the heavens, who will remember how magnificent she was, all the burdens she bore, and all the catastrophes she faced, the braid of childhood in a drawer like a moth-eaten reminder. She never stops wearing black. Her final sorrow never comes. We are trapped in a place between earth and hell, she says, beneath a film of smog. We beat our backs bloody with chains, stab each other in the thigh with pitchforks. Pas que miai, she cries on the phone. You are my first daughter. I'll be there soon. I lie. Who knows how tomorrow will hold me? One day we will return. And when our sorrows over the life we were robbed of meet, something horrible will fall apart. I hate everything I did that estranged me from them. I whimper and slap myself, such meaningless rioting. If it had at least meant something to someone else or me, the most violent quality of repression, my beloved says, is its randomness. Holds my hands as they make their way to the throat. Don't you remember where your aunt said that one day our daughters will toast their cousins on Revolution Square? But will there really be a revolution after the night of revolution? And will it belong to our daughters if it comes? And are those really our daughters slumbering there in bed? And what kind of tombstone will be returned to? So I wanted to say thank you so much to Athena for this beautiful excerpt. We had invited her as an Iranian poet to respond, to send poems in response to the Iranian revolution that's happening right now. And of course, you know, she's always been writing about this. So thank you, Athena. We feel you in spirit with us, and we miss you here. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Annia.
And I'm going to remember to unmute. So I thought I would do something a little different. I figure we're supposed to read from our article, which technically I'll be doing. But I figure those of you on the internet, the 57 people, I think, who are kind enough to take time out of their day to watch us. You can read my article on audimagazine.com if you haven't already. And if you have already, you don't need to hear me read it. And if you haven't, you can go check out the website. I thought I would read parts of the article that got cut, parts of this 8,000 word article, part of the, I don't know, 10,000 other words that got cut. as a way of talking about what do you include, what memories are important, what memories do we include, what memories do we not include, why do we not include certain things, why do we include certain things? Because I think it's part of the question of memory. And also just a great way to talk about the writing process. So with no further ado, I guess I'll give you a brief introduction for those of you who haven't read it, which I assume is most of everybody. My article is about this idea, which is very, very popular here in the West. I'm in New York City, but I reported from the Middle East for on and off for about 15 years and lived mostly there. So I've been reporting on Syria since 2005. And here in the West, there's this very popular idea that the Syrian uprising of 2011 and beyond was triggered by climate change, and that climate change was a key driver, and there's all kinds of different ways of phrasing it. So I've been meaning to write about this since 2011, because there's this huge disparity between people in the West love this idea, left, right, everything in between, everyone from Naomi Klein to the American conservative, they love this idea. Just Westerners love it. People in Syria, not so much. And people from Syria, and most of the people I know from Syria, really upsetting this idea. So anyway, so I decided I would write sort of about that weird kind of disparity of ideas and how we write the story about a war, and why do we like these kind of ideas that explain why wars happen. So yeah, with no further ado, Firdaus. Where does the story of Syria and climate change begin? Let's begin with Firdaus. Like a lot of migratory words, Firdaus traveled from east to west across the Eurasian landmass. It started out in Persia, it hitched a ride through Arabic and Hebrew, and then it took the Mediterranean route via Greece into Europe, where Firdaus became paradise. It was just going to paradise in the old days, really, says Hayyan Dukhan, a professor of, I think he's actually a lecturer at Teesside University. Dukhan grew up visiting his grandfather's farm in Palmyra in, sorry, I'm actually reading from a previous draft and I just have TK. Those of you who are journalists will appreciate. That's like, I'll fill in the details later. It was this amazing green spot, the oasis and other places in Palmyra in the middle of the desert. They were such a heavenly place to be. His grandfather would pump water from a well into a small reservoir. Dukhan and his cousins would swim in the water under the shade of an apricot tree. I remember picking up one of the apricots and eating it, he says. His voice grows slower, dreamier, farther away. It was just so sweet. I remember sitting there having pomegranates, just having the bounty of the farm, the dates, the pomegranates. Ask someone from Syria about the old days and you may hear some of the most beautiful words in Arabic or any other language. Teen, figs, joz, walnuts, lows, almonds, rumman, pomegranates, zaytun, olives, tamar, dates, mishmish, apricots. And my favorite, because it feels so weird and unearthly on your tongue in any language, sferjil, quince. We grew all these things in Syria, says Abdullah Mubarak, a teacher from Homs. We grew almonds, apricots. I worked as a teacher in the mornings and afternoons on our farm, me and my wife. We were in a house in Syria, says his wife, Nawadi, with pride. We grew our own food. We had olives, pomegranates, tomatoes, peppers, figs, apricots, peaches, almonds. Apples, says Mohammed Faris, a researcher who is writing a book about water and politics in Syria. Apricots, cherries, peaches. The walnuts, of course, they were very old, 500-600 years old. You might hear these words in a refugee camp in Greece, or at an organic farm in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Or you might hear them over Skype from a person who used to live in paradise, but who now lives in Europe. I remember just sitting by the water, just seeing the water, hearing the sound of the water, says Dukhan, who now is an expert on tribes and political power. And then we would have a lot of our meals under the trees. And we'll talk about how old these olive trees are and how much they survived. In the evening, we would sit there by the light of the candles because there was no electricity. So quiet, so peaceful. I don't know how many minutes that was. But when you write about war, one of the funny things that you find is that people only really remember the war. People only really want to talk about the war. And when I say people, I mean people not from the war zone, but people in the rest of the world. And one of my favorite things to do is to remind people, there are also ordinary lives here. People have these everyday lives where they, aren't eating rations in a refugee camp, and the war isn't happening, and people were teachers, they lived in a house. So I always try to include stuff like that in my stories, no matter how much they are about a war. Anyway, I have no idea how many minutes I've taken up, so I can read more if you want, or less if you want.
You're good. Like, you only read for about 6-7 minutes. Maybe you could maybe read a couple more minutes, and then we'll pass it to Anna.
Rocket.
A shorter excerpt.
I think I do have a shorter excerpt. I'll skip this. This is a longer excerpt. All right, I'll jump ahead. I was talking about the historic heat wave in 2007, which is part of the story of war and climate change. The next day, we drive to Sednaya, a Christian suburb high up in the mountains, where Damascenes go to escape the heat in mountain restaurants. On the way up, we pass an enormous compound on the top of the hill, like a medieval crusader castle, and just as ugly. Sednaya is also home to a massive prison complex, built in 1987 to house political prisoners. We see walls, a flag, dark high towers. The prisoners are all underground, says a former gallery owner with a dark laugh. They don't get to see the view. 1 year from now, in 2008, the prisoners will revolt and the authorities will kill an unknown number of them. Years later, Amnesty International and Forensic Architecture will construct a virtual memory palace of this prison, where prisoners live and die in total darkness, based entirely on memories and sounds. The sun goes down. The sky is hazy, thick, and grayish brown. We pass through one dark village after another. A Lebanese pop star is singing tonight. The restaurants are full. We climb further up the mountain to an open-air restaurant named Dar al-Amr, neighbor to the moon. The air is cool and we sit at long picnic tables. Well-dressed children run from table to table and scream. 2 nights ago in Sednaya, where I live, there was a huge explosion right next to our house, says a different friend. All of a sudden, the whole house was lit up. We were so scared. We just sat in our house and waited to see what would happen. But nothing did. She tells me there is a weapons warehouse next door to their house. Are there weapons warehouses in every neighborhood? I asked, laughing, incredulous. This is the reason I'm laughing is because there was a previous weapons warehouse explosion the previous day. I'm being a wise ass, but she nods, perfectly serious. Yes, this is the communist way, she says. You hide it in a residential neighborhood, and they think this will keep them from bombing it, but this doesn't work anymore. On our last evening, we sit on Lena's balcony and eat cherries and watermelons out of a blue bowl. There has been a series of small explosions like this, she says. Small attacks here and there, nothing big. Not like what happened in the 1980s when the Muslim Brotherhood tried to take over the country and the current president's father put down the rebellion by erasing entire towns. But these little explosions add up to something, a series of dots that will explode across the country like a string of firecrackers if they are ever connected. There's something going on, she says, looking out over the tall buildings, the trees, the parks. Something boiling behind this peaceful looking country.
Thank you so much, Annia. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Anna, we would love to hear from you.
Good evening, everyone. Annia, thank you very much for this reading. And it's a strange evening because Annia and I don't remember if we've ever met, but we were in Baghdad around the same time. My first book was also a book about food from the same publisher. Just a year before, I think mine came out in 2010 and yours came out in 2011. So I wonder what it is I want to meet in real life. It's a wonderful serendipity that Adi brought us together in this way to, well, I no longer am a journalist, but I also have to say that I was born and grew up in Palmyra of the North, as St. Petersburg is often called, or Leningrad, where I grew up. And the excerpt I'm going to read also contains a list of remembrances of a land, albeit probably in a slightly different context. When I was a toddler, my maternal grandmother would tell me that if I should ever get lost, she would recognize me by the oval birthmark on my left wrist. This is a promise Babushka made often, year after year, when she picked me up from daycare or took me to the park, or when we stood in grocers' lines, when she held my marked hand and told me fairy tales she invented on the spot, fairy tales that included me and characters from my favorite Soviet television puppet show. Each one began with a conventional folktale setting off. Once upon a time, Anichka left home and went. Mama taught nights at a technical college, Dad worked 2 psychiatry shifts at a government-run rehab, and Babushka, who lived with us and taught German at a second-tier college during the day, kept me company every evening. She was my first storyteller, myth maker. Her repertoire was inexhaustible. She told me many other tales, stories of when Mama was a little girl, anecdotes of Babushka's own childhood, some of which I would forget, and some of which I would remember, and some of which I would, much later, learn were make-believe. Babushka was born in Leningrad on April 27, 1927, and had a relatively unhappy childhood. Her mother, an actress, moved away to work in a provincial theater in Murmansk, north of the Arctic Circle, and her father parked Babushka with his sister's family in a large and cluttered communal apartment. As a young child, she often threw temper tantrums. After the city came under siege by the Nazis on September the 8th, 1941, food ran out quickly. Babushka's aunt made aspic out of a carpenter's glue she flavored with peppercorns and bay leaf. That autumn, an average of 5,000 people were dying of hunger in the city each day. Corpses littered the streets, the staircases, the courtyards. Baroque edifices became sepulchres. So great was the famine that people were eating their dead. By the end of the siege, an estimated 800,000 civilians died in Leningrad. Babushka, 14 at the time, managed to evacuate. She and her mother spent the war as refugees in northern Kazakhstan. My last private conversation with her was about her flight from the war. Babushka was 48 when I was born, but her refrain for me was always this: "Staraya babka уже, grandma's become an old hag." When I asked her to tell me her evacuation story, she was 82, a retired professor with a doctorate in linguistics, a brilliant instructor who still tutored German to adoring students, and she had a new refrain: "Всё забываю, I'm forgetting everything." 13 years ago, I returned to Russia on a rare visit from the States after emigrating in 2004, and we sat down at the kitchen table in her single-bedroom apartment in the heart of St. Petersburg. Everything there was sticky with grime: the table, the chairs on which we sat, the enormous 19th century carved oak Welsh dresser. Babushka was forgetting to clean. I had brought a ceramic bottle of Riga Black Balsam, her favorite liqueur, a bitters the color of crude oil. She had some homemade cabbage pie that my mother, her daughter, had made for her but it was stale and I thought a little moldy. It must have sat in her antique Welsh dresser a week or longer, forgotten. Babushka used to cook our meals when I was growing up, but Mama said she didn't cook anymore. She didn't really eat, that she preferred an occasional diet of sliced white salami and chocolate. She pecks, Mama said, using the verb meant for birds. Babushka had been losing weight. I was a war reporter then, and it was the year I documented violence in Chechnya and Afghanistan, listened to soul-killing recountings of torture in the awkward parlors of Iraqi refugees in Amman. My private panopticon of loss by then consisted of genocide and mass starvation, loved ones who had been executed, friends' children who had died of preventable diseases. I was naive enough to think I knew what war felt like. I thought that having witnessed firsthand exodus, exile, flight, and death had prepared me to receive the story of Babushka's own migration from the famine, a story she had never told me when I was little. The story Babushka told me went like this. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, she was a 14-year-old girl living in an old Leningrad apartment with her aunts and cousins. By winter, the only way out of Leningrad was via an ice road, officially called Military Road Number 101, but popularly known as the Road of Life. It trekked across 20 miles of the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, east of the city, the largest lake in Europe. More than 1 million refugees would take this road during the 900-day siege to get to safety on the lake's eastern shore. The shortage of food in Leningrad was so dire that the government mandated all children under the age of 14 to evacuate. They were a burden on the storehouses and a distraction to working adults who subsisted on daily rations of 9 ounces of bread and whatever they could scavenge. Babushka's relatives paid the price of passage for her and her cousins to cross the ice by truck. Babushka would link up with her mother on the other side. Here I nodded. I had seen such trucks of mercy in war zones. I could picture my grandmother and her cousins abroad. I could smell the quilts soiled with diesel and piss and soup and fear. In modern English, these types of migrants are called unaccompanied minors. The adults paid the truck driver up front and gave the children a bottle of vodka to reward him after he delivered them to safety. But the children were foolish. They gave the bottle to the driver right away. Picture Babushka at 14. She's only 5 feet tall and gap-toothed and too thin. She has bright blonde hair that escapes willfully from 2 long braids, breasts that are just starting to show and are still painful to the touch. She is a girl child in a monstrous folktale. It is dark in the back of the truck under a tarp and quilts, and it is cold, and she falls asleep next to her cousins. She does not know that the truck is no longer moving. The driver has drunk all the vodka and fallen asleep before even reaching the ice, and the convoy of trucks in which he was supposed to cross the road of life has left without him. What wakes her up is the sudden noise. Nazi artillery has struck the convoy on the ice ahead. The water is 700 frigid feet deep. There are no survivors. Everything is held together with stories, Barry Lopez once said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. I have been a storyteller for more than 1/4 century, and I have listened to countless stories of people who had fled their homes because of war or prosecution or hunger. Of the 1 billion migrants living on Earth today, 1/4 have crossed political borders. By the end of last year, according to UNHCR, about almost 90 million were displaced by war or conflict or persecution or human rights violation. Most of these people have come Most of these people came from only 5 countries: Afghanistan, Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, and Venezuela. These statistics do not account for the people displaced since February 24th of this year, when Russia launched a full-blown war against Ukraine. UNHCR estimates that as of July, more than 5.6 million Ukrainians had left the country, and more than 7.1 million were displaced internally. Here are some stories I've heard from people who had been forced to leave their homes. Our country is so beautiful, we had to hold our breath. There were tall mountains of gray and yellow stone, and there were valleys of delicate green. The sun shone on peach and apricot trees that bloomed lavender and purple. In your country, you have never eaten so well. Even the bombed-out limestone ruins were beautiful, like pale yellow lace that draped the foothills. There were good times and bad times, like everywhere else. New checkpoints sprung up each day, and young men disappeared at these checkpoints daily. We were very poor. We were hungry and afraid to go outside to forage for food. The mortar shell hit the neighborhood melon stand, and firefighters spent hours hosing down the street, rinsing it of blood, debris, and the sticky juice of broken fruit. They dropped off my husband's body at the gate. My nephew's hands were bound behind his back. His knees had been drilled through. His chest had been burnt with cigarettes. His throat had been slit. They told us to run or they'd kill us. They shot dead my father-in-law and my son, and we ran. We took all we could carry and we ran. We grabbed our children and our passports and ran. We had no time to take anything. We just ran. It was all bad. There is nothing to remember. History is mapped by stories and stories by memories, but memory is a contested terrain. How we remember anything is unreliable and impermanent. Our brain may create memories on the fly. Memory was a literary genre before writing was born, writes Eugenio Montal. Memory, echoes Ocean Vuong, is a choice. Is "we were very poor" a true story, or a recollection prisoned by loss and grief? Are wartime dinners of carpenter's glue aspect a fact or a perception in hindsight? What does it mean for our being in the world that so many of us are carrying memories and stories so devastating that our memories counter one another in the most heartbreaking ways? What does it mean for our notions of truth and reality? Are we prepared to accommodate all of the stories, to be neighbors to new kin burdened with all of the true and false memories? And who is to judge as we pick our way through history, move across the borders of memories, what is true and what is false? Babushka died 9 years after our conversation, following many seasons of vanishing. It's impossible to say when her memory began to deceive her or when she began to deceive her memory. During her final months, she mostly forgot who Mama was, her only child. Many years after Babushka told me her evacuation story, I would learn that it is a variation, a memory her brain adapted as her own. In fact, I would learn that many of her autobiographies were fabrications, appropriations of the stories of others. Following her death, Mama told me Babushka was never in the truck that barely escaped a bombing on the road of life. Only her cousins were there. Babushka had evacuated earlier by train. When I first heard Babushka's evacuation story, I believed it to be true. I added what she told me to what I already knew of the world's brokenness, incorporated her story into mine, producing a mosaic of our history. Does Babushka's lie, her gross misremembering, make the story less profound? Do you feel less heartbroken now that you know that those children in the back of the truck, grimy and cold, swaddled in fetid quilts, have nothing directly to do with me? Do I? Now let's try this on. What if they were not my relatives or relatives of anyone I know? What if their road of life lay not across a frozen European lake in a different country? What if it were ferrying children to safety now, this very moment, over the turquoise seas of the Mediterranean, over the Gulf of Aden, over the Rio Grande? How do our migrations histories determine our humanness? A migrant is an identity of disempowerment imposed by those who have no need to flee. I am a migrant. I moved to the United States from Russia because I was looking for a better life for me and my children. This makes me an economic migrant. I don't fit the stereotype of the needy, the vulnerable, the exposed. This friction has dislocated my sense of history. Such is the double-edged power of stories. They can hold us together, as Lopez has said, and they can distort, isolate, and divide. Do you see? The stories we tell about our origins and those of others shape our heart's capacity to journey alongside. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that. Very different pieces and lifting up different sort of angles of, I don't know, I guess like the way that we remember conflict. I wanted to put this forward, this question to you both, you know, and I'm thinking about what Annia was saying earlier. I think that's such a good way of framing the conversation around, you know, what do we include and what do we exclude? And I feel like your essay, like what happened with Babushka's story, like, you know, I mean, that is like a different way of coming at it. And in a way, it's interesting because there's like inclusion, exclusion, but then there's also insertion. Like she inserted herself into like the memories potentially of other people. And I wanted to ask you both, you know, how do you in your work think about the distinction between memory and history and how they sort of like relate to each other or in conflict with each other or are not in conflict with each other? Or put it another way, in what ways is the tension between memory and history important for you, personally, politically, aesthetically? So whoever feels like jumping on.
Annia, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm also a teacher. I teach journalism, nonfiction, creative writing, stuff like that. And I spend a lot of time with historians just for fun, because historians are awesome. And what's interesting about sort of bridging all of these different worlds is you see, to be a journalist, I always tell the historians, I'm like, I write the first draft. You know, there's that saying, journalism is the first draft of history. And I think one of the most painful things to see is the process of seeing bad, wrong ideas become consecrated. And you see that very painfully and very clearly in war coverage. So for example, covering the Iraq War, you know, it often felt like, you know, the legend of King Canute, sort of trying to keep back the tide. You often felt like you were just sort of really trying to keep back this tide of dumb, wrong, bad ideas, knowing that many of them would go on to become the story of the war.
Right.
And I remember having this moment many years after the sort of early stage of the Iraq War. I was teaching a class, and I said, yeah, you know, remember the beginning, like the early, you know, the right after 9/11, that period before, you know, we invaded Iraq, when everyone thought the war was a good idea. And my students were like staring at me, and they were like, one of them was like, we were 10. And another one, pointed out that they actually didn't, it was news to them that the Iraq War had been this incredibly popular thing, and that, you know, the vast majority of the American public was like, yeah, invade. 70% of the American public believed that Saddam Hussein had some connection to Al-Qaeda, and some connection to 9/11. And having lived through that moment, and by the way, that's not just people who watch Fox News. 70% is everyone. That's people who read the famous example of the New Yorker story, where that basically explicitly said that Saddam Hussein probably had ties to Al-Qaeda and had nuclear weapons and intended to attack the United States. You know, this was something that people in the New Yorker were reading. This is something that, you know, people who thought of themselves as liberal were firmly believing at the time. And to sort of see, and, you know, and I remember at the time being like, wow, this is wrong, this is wrong. Like, and seeing it not only become consecrated as, you know, this is right, but then years later as, oh, no, that never happened. Like, and knowing all along, like, you know, if you studied previous wars, like knowing that this would happen and that it was happening. It's a very weird process. We're always in it. It's always happening. So I always tell my students, like, what is the thing? So, you know, now that we've seen what happened with this previous war and like, oh, wow, wasn't that a terrible idea? What is the thing that's happening now that we're doing the same thing about? That's always my question. And that's always sort of what I'm trying to do. And believe me, it always feels like rolling a rock up a hill.
Right.
So that's my very political, very non-poetic answer to that question.
That's great. Thank you.
I want to challenge the idea of that there is a difference between history and memory. So in Western-centric, Eurocentric tradition, there's a very strong belief that it's history if it's written down, right? The first version of history is the writing of it in a newspaper, or the writing of it, the recounting of it on the radio, or as long it has to be recorded. So a record is history. But in the vast majority of the world, history is not recorded in this way that the Western education teaches us. So that dismissal of, quote, unrecorded history, and I use quote because what is a record, right? And I'll get back to that if we have a little bit of time. But the idea of history as only what's been recorded in the way that is appropriate to the Eurocentric Western tradition is precisely one of the pillars that allows for racist and colonial ideas to prosper. If you don't have a record the way I want the record to be, and we can take this, you know, we can bring this down to a very small scale, like, you know, going through any bureaucracy to get something, you know, that you need, I don't know, your social security number. If your documentation is not the way I say documentation must be, then you don't have history. Then you don't deserve of my respect toward you as a person / community / people with a history. Then, well, then we know what happens, right? So the idea of history as a record that is documented in a particular way, a record that's kept in a particular way, an archive, right? I mean, going back to the idea of the Saidiya Hartman's idea of an archive, right? That's what. So, but why is memory not history? Why is history not why do we consider history unmalleable if, as Annia says, history is so malleable that within 19 years of the Iraq War, which we both witnessed and remembered the running up to, our children don't believe that it was a popular idea among the American, the US Americans, right? So I think that that's something to explore, the idea of what memory is malleable, but history is malleable too. Why is this distinction? Why, and what about the idea of a griot who or the whatever local idea of a griot? My name is Badkhen, my last name. My ancestors were kind of griots for the Yiddish community or the Jewish community. They kept records and recounted it at weddings, right? So what's the side? Why is that not history? Because we mess it up. Well, we mess it up anyway, right? So that's, since the subject of this conversation was like, how does memory and history affect colonialism and affect racism? That's something that I want people to think about. I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, I mean, both of your responses super resonate for me. I mean, I think, it's like, why is there a distinction? Because it serves somebody to have that distinction, right? Like they're sort of, I mean, history is essentially like an empty idea. Like if you call it history and you give it a certain set of criteria by which it will be recognized as history, capital H,
Exactly.
then it can have certain functions that memory is not allowed. It's like that memory is dispossessed of. Like memory is not allowed to have the kind of influence that history has.
Exactly.
Right. This is like very, very resonant and real for me as an Indonesian coming from like a country where we had a suppressed genocide. Like to this day, it's like taboo. And so there's always like this tension between who, which story counts and like who is served when we distinguish between like the various believabilities, right, of like story. Yes. So I want to kind of come back to this idea of mutability, and both of you have kind of touched on it to a certain extent, but I wanted to invite you to kind of dig in more if you wanted to. Like, I think, well, I have two questions that are related to it. Like, one is, what's the sort of liberatory potential that you see in this moment for the fact that history and memory, or collapse, like history as memory, being mutable? Like, what's the liberatory potential for people, for oppressed peoples like the world over, or people who are, living under various imposed forms of violence? Whereas very often, right, that distinction is activated in order to discredit people's memories as like a source of knowledge, as a source of truth, as then a source of believability, and then therefore as a source of motivation for action. So just wanted to put that forward. So like, that's one question. And the other, if you felt like going more into this direction, I am really curious to hear if you yourself, if there's like a memory that you yourself have that has been significant for you and that has evolved over time, where you have seen it sort of like grow and change through across your life, and has that helped you kind of reimagine the present and the future? So they're kind of related questions, but like one I think is taking more kind of a collective scale, and the other one a more personal one. I open it up to you what feels best to respond to, or both. Present.
Annia?
I'm still sort of struggling with this idea of written records as being specifically Western. One of the things that I really loved about Iraq, you know, some of the oldest war records in the world, actually, Epic of Gilgamesh, all the sort of Sumerian and Assyrian and Akkadian records, and is that history? Is it poetry? Is it art? Is it what it's the world's first epic? Well, what does that mean? Is it part of memory? And I think that distinguishing between those things I think that's kind of more of a Western habit. And I think one of the things that really struck me and that I really loved about Iraq was people would speak about Ashurbanipal as though he was like a relative or a friend or like someone they knew. And there's a funny saying in Iraq: beside every palm tree you will find a poet. And people in the Arab world recite poetry pretty much constantly. And there's a sort of a reverence for the written word that you don't actually find in the West. I actually think I would say that we're actually more of an oral culture, and specifically a TV-based culture, TV or internet-based culture. Whereas I do find, having lived in the Middle East for 15 years, I think of that as more of a text-based culture. And the question is, so is history? I find that there's not as much of a distinction between oral tradition and what we think of as sort of the official sources. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. In the Middle East, it has a lot to do with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were obsessed with record keeping. And where that comes from and why that is, I wouldn't begin to, that's for my historian friends to get into. But I don't know, I don't tend to make those distinctions as easily as I used to. And it's kind of more fun that way. So I think to answer your question of like, where is there a liberatory potential in that, and where is it? Yeah, absolutely. Are we writing history nowadays through, for example, TikTok? Or I think, for example, the example in Iran of the song that is taken from people's internet posts of like, this is why I'm demonstrating, right? I forget the word in Farsi. Probably, I bet there's someone in the audience who remembers. But it's this very beautiful song, for those of you who haven't heard it, that became an anthem of the revolution. And the guy just repeats, because of this and all the different reasons that he found from internet posts. Is this part of the official record? Yeah, fuck yeah, of course. And I guess if there is any liberatory potential, it's maybe that we're finding ourselves a little more able to sometimes collapse those distinctions, if only because the institutions are getting weaker. Now, that being said, I am not one of these people who's like, social media is going to make the whole world democracy. Absolutely not. It has been a tremendous boon to surveillance capitalism. But there are still like these cracks that you can find. And I see that happening more than it used to. And that's pretty much, I feel like that's a whole other topic, and I've used up my 2 to 3 minutes. So that's why I'll leave it there, but there's so much more to say.
I do want to hear from Anna, but if we have time later, I kind of just wanted to circle back to you, Annia, around this question of I guess like factuality, like the construction of factuality / verifiability, like when it, particularly in journalistic practices, right? And like how you negotiate that with this sort of, with your view that like these things are, it's like, it would just be lovely to hear how you make sense of that, how you negotiate it, because that can't be easy. But I do want to turn over the floor to Anna first, and then if we have time, we can maybe circle back to that.
Okay, so I'll be very brief. I think the I'm an optimist. This is why I'm still alive. I think that there is tremendous potential for liberation if, and I think that the condition is a learning of a way to accept the multifaceted aspect of memory and history. And I guess I can get into the distinction of Western, non-Western. When I think of Western, I mean, the tradition that was born in the Mediterranean, which of course includes the Levant, right, and Iraq, of record keeping, and then traveled. I also include Russia in the Western world, though many people today may disagree. But I grew up with it. It's a very Western, rigid country. But thinking of what the non-binary everything, right? The non-binary world, the non-binary, it's not that my memory is incorrect because yours is correct. Both of our memories are correct. Actually, all 10 of our memories are correct. So how do we make room for that? I think that the potential for liberation is in the slow acceptance. If anybody in this audience has ever sat down with a group of elders in, I don't know, I was in Mali at one point during an election, and it was stunning to me because there would be 20 people in the room and 20 political parties. And I'd be like, come on, people, combine. But why? This is a Western idea, this Manichaean idea of this or this. What is the idea? What is the multitude of memory? And maybe also to this is again a forwarding of this baton to Annia. The multitude of sources, the multitude of resources, the multitude of viewpoints, the multitude of histories. Yeah. Maybe the history with a capital H is the histories, right? Mm-hmm. Carry on.
I love this, the thing that you said about slow acceptance. That's such a beautiful turn of phrase of thinking about it. Because if we think about what could that look like as a political process? What could that? It feels more possible as a personal process in some ways, and also in some ways even less possible because of the ways that trauma works. But then what would slow acceptance of a political process look like? That's just kind of getting my mind going.
It would have to be done in community. Yeah, something that again, that's something that we are, I think, in the world, both forgetting and remembering at the same time. Paradox. I think everything has to be done in community. Remembering has to be done in community. History has to be done in community. The discussion, the acceptance has to be. I can't just say, okay, Cynthia, I accept. No, it has to, there has to be not a dialogue, but a multitude of voices.
Having sat through a lot of left-wing political meetings, I would say slow acceptance is a very, 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 very interminable meeting. Everyone gets up and everyone has their say. This is, as they say, this is what democracy looks like. It's a 7-hour meeting.
Yep.
And we got a taste of that a little bit in New York, I would say, with Occupy Wall Street, in a very sort of limited, very time specific and very geographically specific way. There's other forms sort of all over the world. So that would be my. Do we have any questions from the audience? I feel
we are almost at time. We have 1 minute left, so I'm not going to open up the floor tonight out of respect for folks' time. But I did want to, in that remaining moment, Annia, might you share some thoughts on factuality in relation to potentially slow acceptance or mutability, of memory / histories.
Wait, what's the question though?
Yeah, how do you navigate the factuality as a criteria, you know?
You argue with editors a lot. You get
hmm.
them to accept things as factual, that, you know, you explain to them why you're including this random piece of memory that doesn't seem to be part of the story.
Right.
But that is part of the lived experiences of the people who, you know, are, you try to get them to include what newspaper editors often refer to as color. So for example, the lists of names, I think it's great that both Anna and I both had these sort of like lists of you know, people itemizing their life before migration, their life before war. We lived in a house, we grew apricots, walnuts,
Yeah.
almonds. And so for me, that, you know, those are facts. That person did live in a house. They did grow walnut, apricot, fig, pomegranate trees. And why is that fact any more or less important than the fact that some, you know, dude who's head of a militia said something to some other reporter, and, you know, or some person who happens to be a corrupt political leader happened to give an interview to the BBC and, you know, make an assertion, or, you know, things like that. So there's facts and facts, right? Which ones do we include? Which ones do we not include? The way I navigate that is by calling up my editors and yelling at them like, you will include this. Taking my name off the story makes you really popular with editors. They really love that when you do that.
Well, I regardless of your popularity, Anya, I really look forward to more of your work. So I hope that Adi's editors
Likewise.
are what is it? The word was the English? Undeterred by your yelling.
And, you know, I think I'm gonna take that from you both, just this, you know, the aspiration and the hope that Adi can be one form for that community of like argument and slow argument and slow acceptance, you know, of like all of the different versions that exist that don't get to make, that currently don't get to make it into the big H history, which we are all like.
The Adi editors were awesome. I'm talking about editors at like the Washington Post. Adi was a chance for me to get all this stuff that I could never get into my news stories.
That's right.
Like at least, you know, out there. So.
Thank you so much for that. That's certainly what we hope to be. I want to say thank you so much to both of you. That was really stimulating and rejuvenating on so many levels. Thank you to everyone who was able to make it. Thank you to our managing editor, Branavi, for handling our tech tonight. And we're going to wrap up and say good night. Happy winter break, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.